Let's talk about what's happening on the ground for employees, for employers. They're feeling the impact already. Companies creating dozens of new jobs already now in response to this epidemic here of COVID-19. Daniel Zhao is senior economist at Glassdoor with us now. Daniel, great to see you. So you've looked at this data. What has it suggested about who's hiring for what in the last 2 months since this outbreak has gotten worse?
Well, I think it's not a surprise that you've seen an increase in medical jobs, so things like nurses and lab technicians. But it's interesting to see that there's a whole public health response going on behind the scenes. So you have jobs like communication specialists or consultants who are helping companies figure out what the best way to respond to the outbreak is.
And so, for a lot of these employees, are they hesitant about getting into new jobs at this point in time? Or is there a mad rush for any opening that there is?
Well, I think it's a little bit too early to say what the impact on the labor market will be in the US in terms of hiring and job seeking. But what we can see is that employees are actually paying very close attention to how their employers are responding to the outbreak. We've seen people who report concern about whether their companies are doing enough. And actually, on the flip side, we've actually seen some employees praise their companies for the actions that they've taken.
Yeah, I think when it comes to hiring, you've seen Facebook, you've seen different companies come out and say that they're limiting on-premise interviews at this point and limiting people from visiting their friends at these big companies to try to, right, mitigate any spread at all. Will the hiring rates themselves actually slow now with people less willing to actually meet in person to do these interviews? I mean, I don't know the last time that anybody really got hired without having a final in-person interview.
hmm Well, I think it's actually interesting that you mentioned some of the interview process because a lot of that has actually moved to virtual platforms, whether it's the traditional phone interview or video interviews. I think that companies are figuring out how to adapt to the outbreak, and they're really doing their best to make sure that business operations won't be disrupted.
Is there anything substantial that you're seeing in the data that the stock market should be privy to at this point in time, as it may impact the jobs report on a go-forward basis, or at least for the past month that we've been tracking here as we just ended February?
hmm Well, the jobs report won't fully price in the impact of the coronavirus, so it's hard to say exactly what the reaction will be to the jobs report this Friday. I think the fact of the matter is that we're still expecting to see a moderating or slowing labor market, and it just remains to be seen how the outbreak evolves over the coming months to see how that actually impacts the labor market numbers.
One of the things we love about Glassdoor is you have a good pulse on the sentiment of employees or former employees of companies. Now that we are maybe going more toward a remote work model, I mean, do you expect there to be any long-term impacts to how people feel about their companies, especially if their companies might react differently in response to this?
hmm Well, I think remote work is a really interesting trend in today's economy, and it's certainly something that every company now has to be thinking about, at the very least in response to the outbreak. So I think that will spur conversations about the viability of remote work in the long term. It's definitely a trend that we're going to be keeping a close eye on Glassdoor.
All right, Daniel Zhao, who is the senior economist at Glassdoor. Thanks so much for the time and insights, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.